To me, I think that a lot of girls who could handle their alcohol are seen as a lot cooler and a lot more interesting than girls who can't. Girls who weren't able to keep up with alcohol were almost either taken advantage of, unfortunately, or were kind of made fun of.
Hello, I'm Rena Ninen. Thank you for joining us. Over the next half hour, we're going to take a deeper dive into the epidemic of binge drinking among American youth, exploring topics like privilege, gender, and race. During the CBSN original, we heard from experts and teens about how binge drinking is not only normal, but can leave young people to feel socially isolated if they don't take part. Dr. Shelly Greenfield is an addiction psychiatrist who works at Harvard Medical School and is an expert in women's mental health and addiction treatment. I spoke with Dr. Greenfield about why it makes sense to treat women differently when it comes to addiction. Dr. Greenfield, how is alcohol processed differently in men and women, and how does that affect treatment?
I mean, one of the first big differences between men and women is that when people drink alcohol, the first place that there is any type of metabolism of alcohol is right in the stomach lining with an enzyme that's called alcohol dehydrogenase. And therefore, ounce per ounce of alcohol that a man or a woman consumes, more of that is actually absorbed into the bloodstream as pure ethanol or pure alcohol for women compared to men.
We're seeing the number rise of women who are binge drinking. Why do you think that gender gap is closing?
Well, so we know actually that the gender gap in terms of alcohol and alcohol use disorders and binge drinking has been closing over the last 30 to 40 years. We know that from the 1980s until about the early part of the 21st century, the 2000s, let's just say, it used to be that the prevalence of alcohol use disorders in males versus females was about 5 to 1. That's in the 1980s. But by the time we're in the decade of the 1990s, that's already closed to about 2.5 to 1 for an alcohol use disorder. And by 2000, it's 2 to 1. So you saw already this incredible closing of a gender gap for men and women in terms of alcohol use disorders themselves. And one of the things that we understand is that if you look at people born after World War II compared to people born before World War II, there was much more social acceptance of drinking, and therefore more women began actually drinking alcohol, more women were exposed to alcohol, and so we slowly but surely saw over a 10 to 20 year period a real change in terms of the numbers of women having an alcohol use disorder. If you look at the whole population of everybody over age 18, you'll still see that binge drinking is more prevalent in men overarchingly by 2 to 1, male to female. But if you start to look in the younger age group, like our youth, you look at the ages 12 to 20 and also college students, 18 to 25, or transitional age youth, what you actually see is that correspondence has really decreased in the younger people even more to about 1 to 1. One thing that a lot of women don't know is that drinking alcohol actually poses a risk for breast cancer later in life. I think this is one of the medical facts that women really need to understand. Right now, as you probably know, our USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, sets what they consider to be a healthful limit on how much alcohol you might drink in a day or in a week. So for women, that's set at 7 what they call standard drinks in a course of a week. For men, it's set at 14 standard drinks. Mm-hmm. What we have now learned in the last 2 years is that a woman who drinks at that level, that's 1 single drink per day, is at a 5 to 9% increased risk of having breast cancer compared to a woman who drinks no alcohol at all. And if you go every glass you add or every drink you add, your breast cancer risk increases. I think a lot of women, we know that there's been a rise in breast cancer. 1 in 11 women have this risk. A lot of women are worried about it, and they want to know what kinds of things they can do. This is a major behavioral change that women can actually make to lower their risk for breast cancer.
How has the alcohol industry adapted as you see the rise in women binge drinking? How have they adapted with that?
I think if we go back to cigarette smoking and look in the 1970s when the prevalence of cigarette smoking in women was actually quite a bit lower than men, what we did see was direct marketing to women in the Virginia Slims advertising campaign. And what we did see in the decades afterward, when there's direct to women marketing of cigarettes, that we saw a rise in women smoking. I think if you look at the ads that have run for the beverage industry, whether it's wine or beer or vodka or other beverages, you will see that there's been direct marketing to women. You'll see that there are labels that are directly marketed, like wine bottles called Mommy's Time Out. There are beer labels that are for women. A lot of these have pink labels. They are pink in coloring. There's been a lot of marketing to young women and to young mothers, actually. And I do think that, although we can never completely know whether the advertising is a consequence of some sociocultural change, I think there's no question that direct advertising to groups actually usually is followed by a rise in that behavior or that use.
Is binge drinking an epidemic, and what can society do to limit binge drinking?
That's a really great question. Binge drinking apparently really, all the data shows us it is an epidemic, and the rise has been over the decade from 2000 to 2010, and now from 2010 to 2019, we see absolutely a rapid acceleration in binge drinking. We worry a lot about it because not only are the long-term effects that I mentioned to you, the health effects, which can include things like liver disease and cardiovascular disease, elevated risk for breast cancer amongst women, and other cancers. Those are sort of longer-term effects, but in the acute situation with binge drinking, we worry a lot about accidents, motor vehicle accidents, other kinds of injuries, vulnerability to assault. For young women, sexual assault, unwanted sexual contact. All of these things are more of the acute effects of binge drinking. So what can we as a society do about it? I think that's really important. I think in some ways we need to think about perhaps each age group and population and what are the drivers there. Within college campuses, what kinds of things can we do to make binge drinking actually a more of a stigmatized activity or behavior as opposed to one that's desirable?
All right, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Shelly Greenfield. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, we spoke with Temple University professor Dr. Lawrence Steinberg. We asked him how drinking culture may impact teens later in life. That's after the break.